peaceful escape, that was the plan. I had booked a remote cabin tucked deep within the woods, hoping for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of everyday life. The listing described it as charming and rustic, surrounded by endless wilderness with no distractions, no neighbors, no cell service, just pure solitude. I wasn't entirely sure if isolation suited me, but I convinced myself that disconnecting for a few days might do me some good. The drive was uneventful at first, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, an eerie stillness settled in. The towering trees grew denser, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood alone in a small clearing, appearing far more aged than the pictures had suggested. The wood was worn, the windows clouded with grime. Still, I brushed off my unease. "Just a little neglected," I muttered, hoisting my bag and stepping inside. The first night was uneventful, if not a little eerie. The silence out there was absolute. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. I lit a fire in the small stone hearth and read until late. I remember joking to myself about how all horror movies start like this. I laughed, but it lingered in the back of my mind. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the window. My room was on the second floor, and there was no tree close enough for a branch to reach. Heart pounding, I stayed frozen in bed, straining to hear. After a few moments, it stopped. I told myself it was just a raccoon or some other animal. Still, it took me hours to fall back asleep. The next morning, I found something odd. Just outside the front door, there were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints. They were too large to belong to me, and the toes were unnaturally long. Maybe someone's messing with me, I thought, but I wasn't convinced. I felt unnerved but tried to laugh it off. That day, I decided to hike one of the trails that wound through the forest. The further I went, the more oppressive the trees became. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, which felt wrong. By the time I turned back, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, shadowy fingers through the trees. When I returned to the cabin, I found the front door ajar. I swore I had locked it. Inside, everything looked untouched except for a single chair in the middle of the living room. It was turned to face the window, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the forest. I hadn't moved it. I tried to brush it off, but the tension was palpable. That night, I didn't sleep well. The second night was worse. I woke again, this time to the sound of faint whispering. It was so soft I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely coming from outside my window. I wanted to leave the room, but I was paralyzed with fear. I stayed in bed, clutching the blanket until the whispers faded. In the morning, I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to leave the next day, cutting the trip short. But when I went to pack the car, I found all 4 tires slashed. The cuts were deep and precise, not something an animal could do. I thought about walking to the nearest ranger station, but the thought of wandering the forest in the dark was too terrifying. That night, everything escalated. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate. Then came the knocking, 3 loud, measured bangs on the front door. I grabbed a fireplace poker and huddled in the living room. The knocking came again, this time from the back door, then the windows. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was toying with me. At one point, I worked up the courage to fling the front door open. No one was there, but as I stepped outside, I saw something move at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was pale and featureless, and it moved with a jerky, unsettling gait. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I barricaded myself in the living room, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. The noises continued. Scratching, knocking, and that faint, unintelligible whispering. At some point, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, because I woke to daylight streaming through the windows. The noises had stopped. When I stepped outside, the forest felt wrong. The air was heavier, the trees seemed closer. The footprints were back, circling the cabin in a chaotic pattern. I didn't waste any time. I loaded up my backpack and started walking down the road, hoping to flag down a car or find help. I didn't make it far. When I finally reached the main road, a passing trucker picked me up. He said I was lucky to have made it out. "That forest," he said, shaking his head, "has a bad history. People go missing out there. Always have." I never spoke about what happened after that. I still have nightmares. The tall figure, the whispering, the feeling of being watched. I'll never go near a forest again. Some places are better left alone. City life had drained me. The endless traffic, blinding neon signs, and suffocating crowds had become unbearable. I needed an escape. Somewhere quiet, untouched, far from the chaos. That's when I stumbled upon a travel blog raving about a hidden coastal village. It sounded perfect, an unspoiled retreat where time seemed to slow down. Few maps even acknowledged its existence. Described as a forgotten paradise, the village boasted rugged cliffs, pristine beaches, and a charming inn called the Seafarer's Rest. The photos were mesmerizing, and the promise of complete solitude was too enticing to ignore. Getting there proved more difficult than I anticipated. The GPS failed halfway through, forcing me to rely on a crumpled set of printed directions. The road twisted through dense forests and creaked beneath old wooden bridges. Just as doubt crept in, a weathered sign emerged from the mist, "Welcome to Dunsloe Bay." The village was as picturesque as advertised, but there was something off about it. The streets were almost empty, and the few people I saw seemed wary, their eyes darting away when I looked at them. I chalked it up to small-town shyness. The innkeeper, a middle-aged woman named Martha, greeted me with a strained smile. She handed me an old-fashioned key and said, "Room 3, breakfast is at 7. Please, don't wander the village after dark." Her tone was polite, but her words carried an edge of warning. I laughed nervously. "Why not?" Her eyes flickered toward the window where the sun was beginning to set. "Just don't," she said, then turned and walked away. The room was small but cozy, with a large window overlooking the ocean. Exhausted from the drive, I decided to take a walk along the beach before dinner. The sunset painted the sky in fiery hues, and the crashing waves were soothing. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Further down the beach, near the edge of the cliffs, a group of people stood in a circle. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but their silhouettes looked stiff and unnatural. I waved, but none of them responded. They just stood there, unmoving as the tide crept closer. Uneasy, I turned back to the inn. Martha was waiting for me in the dining room, her face pale. "You went to the beach?" she asked, her voice tight. "Just for a little while," I said. She didn't respond, but I could feel her disapproval. That night I couldn't sleep. The mattress was lumpy, and the room felt oppressively hot despite the cool sea breeze. Around midnight I heard it, a low, mournful humming. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the inn. I peeked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. The next morning I asked Martha about the humming. She stiffened, then forced a smile. "Just the wind," she said. "It can play tricks on you out here." I didn't believe her, but I let it go. That afternoon I decided to explore the village. The streets were eerily silent, the buildings weathered and worn. Most of the shops were closed, their windows boarded up. The few people I saw avoided me, hurrying past with their heads down. At the edge of the village I found a small cemetery. The headstones were old and crumbling, their inscriptions worn away by time. But one grave stood out. It was newer, the soil still fresh, and the headstone bore no name. Just the words, "We warned you." A chill ran down my spine. That night, the humming returned, louder than before. This time it was accompanied by whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Unable to stand it any longer, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The village was cloaked in shadows, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my feet. The humming grew louder as I approached the beach. When I reached the cliffs, I saw them again, the figures from before. They stood in a circle, just like they had the first night, but now they were closer. I could see their faces, pale and expressionless, their eyes wide. I called out, my voice trembling. They turned to look at me in unison, their movements unnaturally synchronized. My flashlight flickered, then went out. Panic surged through me as the humming turned into a deafening roar. I ran back to the inn, my heart pounding. Martha was waiting for me at the door, her face grave. "You shouldn't have gone out," she said. "What's going on here?" I demanded. She hesitated, then said, "Some things are better left alone." That night, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the refund or the long drive back. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my car, I noticed something on the windshield. A handprint, large and wet like someone or something had pressed against it. I didn't look back as I drove away, but even now, in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear the humming sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet, it creeps in, low and mournful, and sometimes I see them in my dreams. The figures on the beach, their empty eyes staring at me. I don't think I escaped Dunsloe Bay. I don't know why I thought driving cross-country alone was a good idea. Maybe it was the promise of freedom, the thrill of the open road. But when my car broke down in the middle of nowhere, it felt like the start of a bad dream. It was past sunset, and I was stranded on an empty stretch of highway with no cell service. The only sign of civilization was an old neon sign flickering in the distance. Pine View Motel. The name seemed ironic, given there wasn't a tree in sight, just barren fields and the silhouette of distant hills. I pushed my car as far as it would go and parked outside the motel. The building was dilapidated, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. I was desperate, though, and the thought of sleeping in my car made my skin crawl. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something metallic. The receptionist was an elderly man with sunken eyes and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. His name tag read Earl. "Just passing through?" he asked, sliding me a key. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, forcing a smile. His lips twitched as if he were about to say something else, but instead he turned away, muttering, "Room 6. End of the hall." The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet damp underfoot. Room 6 wasn't any better. The bed sagged in the middle, the wallpaper was stained with watermarks, and the small TV on the dresser hummed faintly, even when off. I told myself it was just for one night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was so strong that I got up to check the door and window multiple times. Both were locked. Still, the sensation wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I heard the first noise, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from the wall behind the bed. I pressed my ear against it, but the sound stopped. "Old pipes," I whispered to myself. But when I lay back down, the tapping resumed, louder this time. I turned on the TV to drown it out, but the screen was nothing but static. As I fiddled with the remote, I noticed something strange. The static wasn't random. It seemed to form shapes, fleeting and indistinct. At one point, I thought I saw a face. I turned the TV off and tried to sleep again. That's when the voices started. It wasn't loud, just a faint whispering, like a conversation in another room. I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded urgent, almost pleading. I pressed my ear to the wall again. Nothing. But as soon as I stepped away, the whispers returned. I decided to confront Earl. Maybe he could explain the noises. But when I opened my door, the hallway was pitch black. The lights that had been dim earlier were now completely out. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate, but the beam felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. When I reached the reception desk, Earl wasn't there. The desk lamp was on, casting long, eerie shadows, but the room was empty. Then I noticed something. The guest book was open, and my name was the only one written on the page. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the dim light around it, flickered at the end of the hallway. It was the shape of a person, but wrong, twisted, contorted, like it didn't belong. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and empty, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally as it slowly glided toward me. I ran back to my room, heart pounding, and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. That's when I noticed the message. My phone, which had been out of service, suddenly had one notification. It was a text, but the sender was blank. The message read, "Leave before it's too late." I grabbed my bag and ran. The hallway felt alive, shadows shifting as I reached the exit. Behind me, the door to room 6 creaked open. Outside, the cold air hit me. My car started instantly. As I sped off, the motel vanished into darkness. The next morning, I told a mechanic about it. His face went pale. The Pineview Motel? That place burned down years ago. I didn't ask more. I just kept driving.